I want to start going over some more of the old prize ring and Broughton's era boxing, as well as some of the French sources and perhaps even some other HEMA hand-to-hand stuff. I think, one, that's of interest and there's not enough coverage of it, and two, it's something that I'm personally studying for my own edification. I just particularly like HEMA and Western martial arts. And I wanted to start with actually one of the older sources that I have available to me from the English tradition of boxing. As far as we can tell, kind of the boxing tradition in Europe went pretty dark between the fall of Rome and the late Renaissance. Let's just call it the late 1600s, early 1700s. James Figg was the first boxing heavyweight champion, and the lineal championship today goes all the way back to James Figg, but he wasn't the origin of it, right? It was still a tradition that had been cropping up sometime in the 1600s, just we don't have much documentation on it. It's often cited that Jack Broughton created the first set of rules for boxing in the English tradition. And I keep having to say that because we know for a fact Greeks and Romans had their own kind of boxing traditions. Obviously, the Chinese boxing styles have their own timeline. We know that there are African boxing styles like Dambe. I don't know anything about their history or culture, so I can't speak to that in any way, shape, or form. But in the European tradition, we don't see too much boxing. And the general idea is really that in armed society, boxing is only going to be sport. There was apparently an Italian sport, but there's not much history on it currently available. And there seems to have been kind of I don't want to say a prohibition, but a distaste for boxing sport. Wrestling was the proper way to do hand-to-hand combat in those days. So there's a lot that we don't know. There's a lot of dark spots, and I'm not a historian, so you'll have to find somebody else who's gone through and dug through obscure libraries and stuff to maybe find some tidbits of things. But when we do see boxing start cropping up, it didn't look anything like it does today. In fact, we know for a fact that early boxing included grappling and did not restrict you to only punching with the front of the fist like it is today. Basically, there were no prohibitions other than a gentleman's handshake of what you agreed to. And we do have at least one source talking about boxing. And I'm going to, throw it up here on the whiteboard for you. But I've got it here so I can accurately say it. In Sir Thomas Parkin's book on Cornish hug wrestling, it's called the In Play. He's got four small paragraphs. I mean, it's half a page on boxing. And he says, right, by all means have the first blow with your head, right? So headbutting was allowed, very clearly against the rules today. Now, he goes on more, but he's talking about, hitting them in the body to take their wind. And then he says, if you have long hair, soap it. Soap your hair. Because he doesn't want them to be able to pull your hair. Hair pulling was part of it. The best holds are the pinion with your arms at his shoulders. He's basically talking about a bear hug. So holding the body, clinching, was allowed. Let's see. Get your right arm under his chin and your left behind his neck, and let your arms close his neck straight by holding each elbow with the contrary, and crush his neck. So theoretically, chokes and neck cranks were totally allowed. Let's see. Your fingers in his eyes. Eye gouging was allowed, expressly against the rules today. Let's go. Yep, twist his head round, so more of that. If your adversary take a fast hold with each of his hands at each side of your collar and thrust his thumbs against your throat and windpipe, speedily, that you may not want wind, with your right hand hold his fast, right? So hold his grip there by the wrist, and with the left fort elbow, press the top of his arm down upon his feeble. So fort and strong, right? This is sword terms. So he's basically saying use the strong part of your arm, the meaty part towards your elbow, versus his wrist, the small part. Press the top of his arm betwixt your right hand and his elbow, or quick over his wrist for grips, or proceed for the pinion, or if he has his hands at your hair and he thrusts his thumbs in your eyes, proceed after the foregoing method. And that's it, right? That's all he talks about. He doesn't talk about punching. He doesn't talk about kicking. He doesn't really mention throwing, but he does mention holds. But he mentions hair pulling, eye gouging, crushing the neck, whatever that may result in, and the windpipe. He talks about manipulating the arms. If somebody, it sounds like he's talking about, smashing down on their arms. It's still a common traditional martial arts thing if somebody's trying to squeeze at your neck. Notice he says the collar, right? Because if somebody's just doing the angry boyfriend choke, that's the easiest thing in the world to get out of. It's just not a very secure grip, and it's very, very simple to get out of. Even if you're being pressed against the wall or the floor, it's not that hard to get out of. With a collar, that becomes a different story. So, just keep in mind that when you're doing those defenses against that front choke like that, it's probably meant actually to be versus somebody grabbing you by the collar, because versus the hands, it's kind of nothing. Anyway, I want you to understand that this was boxing. This was before Jack Broughton's rules. This was this book is from 1727. Jack Broughton's rules weren't till 1743. So, this was almost 20 years before the first rules of English boxing. And what we're talking about here is all the stuff that's considered dirty boxing now. And it kind of looks more like wrestling than it does. Now, granted, this is a book on wrestling. It's not a book on boxing. He's talking about using wrestling in a boxing context. But it's not a how-to manual on boxing, which makes you believe that boxing during this period was a very informal affair, probably something akin to bar brawling, probably not akin to what we think of as a scientific method of defending yourself with your fists. So keep that in mind, right? Where boxing comes from is not where boxing ended up. And when we talk about historical boxing, we are not talking about, and look, the term pugilism is garbage. It's hardly used at all in any of these old sources. More often, the fighters will be referred to as pugilists, but the art is almost never referred to as pugilism, and every book calls the art boxing. Every single one of them, from the period of Jack Broughton and later, calls the art boxing. So understand that, it's always been boxing. It just is what it is, right? The word boxing is kind of cool, right? It seems to go back to possibly Dutch, right? It's kind of unknown origin, but it may be an imitative sound, right? The idea, box, the idea of onomatopoeia, right? The sound of fist hitting somebody. That's an interesting idea. Some people will say it goes back to the Greek boxwood tree. I don't know, maybe, probably not, but that's a possibility. Interestingly enough, if you translate the Chinese Chunfa, which is Mandarin, or Kunfa, which is Cantonese, or if you read it in Japanese, Kempo, right? Kempo, where I originally came from. Kempo actually translates into English most accurately as boxing. The literal words mean fist method. A lot of people will translate as law of the fist, but that's wrong. It does mean law, but it also means the jurisdiction of something, or the purview of something, the idea, and thus the method, right? It's basically saying the formal practice and study of and application of something. So in this case of the fist, as opposed to wrestling. So Kempo, Chunfa, Kunfat really should most appropriately be translated as boxing. And that is indeed what the English called it when they saw Chinese martial arts. They called it Chinese boxing, because that's essentially what it was. And keep in mind, when you understand what boxing was back in the day, of course they would call it boxing, because it was fist fighting and it was not clearly just a wrestling contest. It was a scrapping, striking affair that happened to also include some stand-up grappling. Most grappling was stand-up grappling back then, even the actual wrestling. So it is what it is, but just keep in mind that it's like boxing is boxing. Boxing means fist fighting and scrapping, and it doesn't just mean the modern sport of punching with the front of the fist above the waist. So the above the waist thing came in with Jack Broughton's rules too. We'll get into that in another video in another time, because I could go on and on and on. As you can see, I've got a binder full, and this is just the stuff I have from Jack Broughton's era. And there's plenty of stuff from the prize ring rule era. And then, of course, everybody's favorite, Jack Dempsey, was very much in the spirit of the prize ring, despite the fact that he was fighting under the modern rules in the 1900s. That's why Jack Dempsey, even though he doesn't get a pass as HEMA, he's such a very good source, because what he does is much more in the vein of this old school bare knuckle stuff than it was in the vein of the modern school of boxing. He was very much kind of a cusp character between the old bare knuckle tradition and the modern glove tradition, despite the fact that he lived well after the bare knuckle tradition, which is really, really cool and interesting. That's another video for another time. We'll probably do some Jack Dempsey videos too. But anyway, look, boxing is not what you think of when you say boxing. And early boxing was pretty wild. So I will leave it there, and definitely expect some more videos on historical boxing in the future. I will talk to you guys later. Good journey. Thanks for watching. Like, subscribe, share. Check us out on our other socials, and please head over to blacksunboxing.com to get a little more info, including how to contact us. Furthermore, if you are in the Phoenix area, please feel free to stop in, say hi, join in for a class, whatever. Also, if you ever see us cite sources or just for additional content, please check out our Substack. That is where we put all of the sources we use in our videos and is a major part of this. Plus, it serves as a membership platform for long distance learning and for people who would like to support us but aren't local. We would greatly appreciate it if you signed up. Even just the free membership helps us out a lot. All right, I will see you guys in the next video. Good journey.